Cucurachi was presenting an absence sequence, the role of cooperation in understanding an Italian humorous text. Roberto, the screen is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, or good evening. I'm Roberto Cucurachi, an Italian student in Napoli's University Federico II, and I just experienced a pretty heavy earthquake. And today I'd like to propose a discussion over the role of cooperation in understanding a humorous text, and I'd like to do so by analyzing what I've defined as an absurd sequence, referring to this article that was published in 2024, so last year, on the Rolling Stone online version, on Rolling Stone magazine online version, by Alessandro Gori, called Perdersi per strada con l'usucapione, getting lost with acquisitive prescription. In order to do that, I think it's important to highlight some premises of my reasonment. And the starting point would be the role of expectation in comedy. I think that regardless of the theory that we analyze or that we take into consideration, expectation is generally regarded as one of the key elements in obtaining a laugh. If we just consider the general theory, for example, it's the direct consequence of the activation of the two scripts, or for example, the release theory. Of course, the expectation is what builds up the tension that is later released by the punchline. Therefore, I think it's important to focus on the cognitive structures, and I think it's important to focus on the way in which, in the reader's mind and in the hearer's mind, this expectation builds up. And from a theoretical standpoint, I followed Eco's theories published in 1979 in Lector in Fabula, about the cooperation in understanding a narrative. The first element that I'd like to point out about this article is the set of the paratextual elements that we're presented with. And the first one of them would be the Rolling Stone magazine itself, which is, with a bit of intertextual knowledge, we all know that it's kind of musically oriented as a magazine, and it does deal with a different series of topics. As we can see here, they have music, they have movies and TV, they have politics, culture, and Sanremo, which is an Italian music festival. But from the understanding and the knowledge of the broader context of the magazine itself, we're not really given many elements in order to be ready for a humorous text, for a humorous article. Nor are we given such a category of elements by the title, which is pretty interesting to me. Literally is Perdersi per strada con l'usucapione, so getting lost with acquisitive prescription. And it's pretty interesting to me because it's supposed to kind of lead us towards a first orientation towards the text. It's supposed to give us some first elements about the content of the text. And instead, it kind of confuses us and uses this very interesting word, which is usucapione. And not only it's a law-related term, so probably not really something that would be dealt with on a daily basis, but then uses also an ancient concept and a weird word that we're not used to hear that often. And so we are kind of introduced to the tone of the article and not really to the content of it. And we're not really helped in understanding the text or in getting prepared to what the text actually contains, neither by the picture, which in this case includes a girl holding a vocabulary, an Italian vocabulary, which seems to suggest that we should be focusing on the words that will be used in throughout the text, and so we are left with some kind of misleading premise in this case. We are supposed to be talking about usucapione. Instead, we'll be talking about Boccassa's dictatorship, because this author is really brilliant. And what I think it's interesting in this case is that the first set of 4 words, which is the same one for the first sentences of the 2 paragraphs that I've analyzed, it's both useful for the processes of topic recognition and for the inherently comic purposes. As a setup for the joke, and on the other hand, it also acts as a first recognition element for us to understand what the content of the text will be. I've underlined them in similar colors in both of the instances because I think it's interesting that the author Alessandro Gori uses the same structure for both of the sentences, throwing us off guard in both cases. And so in the after the setup, which is the yellow part, Bokassa's dictatorship, which is a pretty full setup, although only of 4 words, because it leads us to think that there would be a certain tone, a certain serious tone throughout the following text. And it also leads us to assume that it's very likely that it will be the topic will be dealt from a political viewpoint, or maybe a social viewpoint, or maybe an historical viewpoint. And so this acts as a setup and gives us the information that we're supposed to be needing in order to decode the message. And then we're presented with a couple of job lines. In the first instance, it's this natural here. Literally, the sentence says, Bokassa's dictatorship is a complex natural phenomenon still studied to this day. And of course, I would argue that a dictatorship is not necessarily a natural phenomenon. And the same thing happens in the second instance, where it literally says Bokassa's dictatorship was invented at the end of 19th century. Now, same goes for the second instance. I would argue that to invent is not really, at least in Italian, it's not really an appropriate verb to associate with dictatorship. And plus, there is this small misperiodization, because of course, with a bit of a historical context, we know that Bokassa's dictatorship took place in the 20th century instead of the 19th. But what I think it's interesting in both cases is that the silence still holds its kind of plausible appearance. In both cases, until we get to the punchline, the sentence is likely to be almost completely serious. So far, we know in the first instance, for example, that Bokassa's dictatorship is a natural phenomenon still studied to this day. And while reading, now in the spotlight, but while reading, we probably don't even notice that much natural. We just maybe may notice that it's a weird word, but in general, it's still plausible, the sentence. And the same goes for the second instance, until we get to the actual punchline. And the actual punchline in this case says it's Bokassa's dictatorship. It's a natural complex phenomenon still studied to this day that has lots of positive sides, but also some other that were so negative that makes you want to quit analyzing the first one. I think it's a pretty brilliant punchline in that sense, because it's a sudden drop in tone, first of all, and then it's a recursive structure. So it's two things that we're not expecting, and they are not necessarily related to what the setup is in terms of content, but more in terms of what we expect the tone to be and the general environment to be. The sentence is really it's really fun to me, because it kind of adds this personal comment, this personal opinion that's really unnecessary in a serious or supposedly serious article. And in the second case, the punchline is actually a bit different in that sense, because it kind of keeps a connection with the job line in this case, instead of the setup. Uses it as a new kind of setup, because it links with the word invented, because if it's invented, then who can invent it other than an inventor, Guglielmo Marconi, of course. So the sentence goes, Bokassa's dictatorship was invented at the end of 19th century by Guglielmo Marconi in order to scam an insurance company. So it's interesting the way in which the author can throw us off guard by linking to what seemed to be a secondary element instead of the actual main topic that we recognize as a topic. And then he also adds this implausible reason. And the next logical step after the recognition of a topic that's supposed to be the main guide towards the understanding of the text is the assumption of some sort of coherence, some sort of regularity in textual behavior. So we tend to assume that given the topic, the text will also follow along and will also kind of act in a coherent way on the basis of the topic that we recognized. And on that basis, we activate a semantic network. So we tend to pre-activate some connections between the words that we already given by the text, the words that we already know, and the concepts that we already know, and the things that will be more likely discussed throughout the article in this case. And what I think is really interesting of the style of Alessandro Gori, it's the specific selection of these words that I've highlighted. We'll only be analyzing two of them. And I think it's pretty interesting, the specific position within the semantic network where he gets these words. Take, for example, this one here, ventotene. Now, to an Italian speaker, ventotene kind of has a connection to the setup, to the topic that we recognized. Only with a part of it, though, because we do connect it with a dictatorship. Not Bokassa the one, though, because we tend to connect it to Ventotene was this small island where political opponents were sent in confinement during the fascist period. So there is a hidden connection. There is kind of a secondary connection. And that's exactly the sphere, the area from which the author is taking his references. And that's what makes them fun. In order to demonstrate that, I've tried to swap a couple of words with some alternatives to demonstrate that it selects them not from the main focal point of the semantic network. It doesn't choose the words, the comic words from, of course, the ones that are more likely to appear, nor does it choose them from words that are completely out of sight. It selects them from that kind of middle ground between these two extremes. And look at the Ventotene example, for example. And I've tried to swap it with Birao, which is an actual city from the Central African Republic, so where Bokassa's dictatorship took place. And at that point, the sentence would sound like the negative sides, the one I was talking about earlier, were the dozens of political opponents that were sent to confinement in Birao. At this point, the sentence has completely lost all of its comic potential. And it sounds completely plausible. It may not be historically accurate, but it's completely plausible. It doesn't have the same potential in comedy because it's more towards the center of the semantic network. It's a word that we're expecting. Same process is applied here for the Combonian missionary. Now, Combonians were specifically active in those parts of Africa, so it's actually pretty precise as a reference. But even if we don't know that much about Combonian missionaries, in general, there is a hidden, an underlying connection between the concept of a missionary and the general geographic contextualization of Bokassa's dictatorship. So there is a connection. And although light and although very complicated, it's there and it's important for it to be there. And I've tried to swap it with a word that would be completely out of sight, completely out of the semantic network. It would be really, really hard to activate a word such as this dishwasher. And the sentence would sound like, this sad phenomenon ended in 1996 thanks to Bokassa, apparently a ruthless dictator, but actually a dishwasher infiltrated in Bokassa's dictatorship. Now, in this case, it's also interesting because it would keep the same comic humorous potential, but in a completely different way, in a completely different atmosphere. It would sound definitely as an absurd type of comedy, and not this kind of semi-serious and at the same time environment in which the author has put these words. Now, on the basis of the elements that we've activated from the text and the assumption of this regularity, we start to mix the elements that were activated by the text with some kind of common and intertextual knowledge. So we kind of mix the two components in order to suppose, in order to guess what the text is more likely to tell us, probably. And what's interesting about this specific instance that I've highlighted in yellow is that this kind of interaction between our common knowledge and intertextual knowledge is not only about the content, but also the mechanism, the our very understanding of the word and of the logic of the word itself. And that's why, after having activated only one name, basically, it's a story with one person in the cast, besides Guglielmo Marconi, which is clearly there for the punchline. But in general, he's mentioned 6 times Bocassa in only 2 paragraphs. And once that he has like installed in our mind this one character, funnier when at the end he gets to the last punchline of the periods, which is he got to the top of the dictatorship only to later sabotage it from within and dismantle it with the heroic sacrifice of his own life, taking every blame. Now, besides the absurdity of the sentence itself, it is even more comic because it deals with our understanding of the plausibility of the story itself. We assume by our general knowledge that such a story would generally need at least 2 characters to work. Instead, he creates this weird, absurd effect of twisting again and again the perspective towards what's being narrated by basically building around the same character in a sequence of absurdity. So, for example, of course, we assume that he's supposed to be already at the top of his own dictatorship, if it's his own dictatorship. Assume that he is not very likely to have sabotaged from within his own dictatorship and to have dismantled it, sacrificing his own life. I mean, it's a series of nonsense, basically, which is funnier because we are only visualizing him as if he was the only character, as if in our understanding of the world, it was possible for one person to be all of these different roles. And another element we're sensitive to while in the performative act of reading is rhythm. We tend to recognize patterns, we tend to recognize regularities in sounds, in structures, in words. And while reading, the fact itself that the name Bocassa appears so many times, sometimes in a structure with the Bocassa's dictatorship, and some other times with just on its own, it's very, all of the processes that I've described are happening. We are also sensitive to this kind of rhythm, and the rhythm is by definition the recognition of some kind of regularity. And so, for example, in this case, when the Guglielmo Marconi joke hits, we are already in a situation in which we are assuming that he's building a text, in such a way that whenever there is a chance for him to put a name, he will go for Bocassa. And that's already enough to increase the possibility for the joke to be actually funny. So basically, to sum up, I'd say that these are, sorry, one too much. And I'd say that these are basically the ways in which we participate into the joke, in which we play along with the person who's trying to make us laugh. We start with the topic recognition. We start with this first orientation towards the text that comes from the paratextual elements and from the first words. And then we assume some kind of coherence, some kind of regularity, through which we are able to actually activate a semantic network, so to make resonance, so that the words that we already heard or read are able to resonate with other words that we already know, and they are, in our opinion, in our semantic network, more likely to appear again in the text. And on that basis, we mix those elements with the common and intertextual knowledge in order to suppose, in order to the content of the, while being able to recognize patterns and while being able to understand and kind of being sensitive to other performative elements, rather performative elements. And so basically what I'd like to propose today is just that this is partially and in a, of course, simplified way, the way in which we play along with the joke teller, in this case, with Alessandro Gori, the author of this article. And that's it for me. I don't know if you have any questions. In that case, I hope to have the answers.
I'm sure most of the participants lack a lot of context. So if you can actually give some Just for example, explaining where the whole thing, the whole situation takes place, for instance, will be quite easy for us to understand a lot of cultural references, because your presentation was actually full of.
You mean about the Bokassa's dictatorship, or
Exactly.
about
Yeah,
okay,
the
okay,
connection
okay.
between Bokassa and, of course, the references. Yeah, that's right. Starting from here, baby.
Okay, okay, okay. Well, I'd say that Bokassa's dictatorship took place in the should be in the 70s in Central African. What is interesting in that sense is that actually the article doesn't really require that much of a knowledge of the actual dictatorship itself. It's rather embedded with a series of hidden elements of Italian culture. So, for example, as I was saying at the beginning, the magazine itself and the knowledge of the magazine itself. So, what can we expect from that kind of device, from that kind of environment? And what I think it's the most absurd element right there, it just sets the tone for a series of unlikely words, basically. I cannot stress enough how much usucapione is just a word that we hear once in a lifetime, and then we just know about it. It's kind of a general knowledge concept that we all know about, and we never use it unless we're talking with someone who just studied it at the university in law school. And so those are like the general thing in that sense is that Bokassa's dictatorship, it's kind of positioned as a set of words, as a concept, as a historical phenomenon. It's kind of placed in the same realm as the words I was showing you in this slides, because it's also something that, just as usucapione, just as basically Guglielmo Marconi and almost all of the references within the text, it's just something that we've heard of once and are part of his playful style, are part of his playful free association of concepts and words in this sequence of absurdity, which is the basis of my definition of an absurd sequence.
Well, I'd like to chime in on this, and I hope you can hear me because the audio is very glitchy. For an Italian, Guglielmo Marconi is like you hear about Guglielmo Marconi all the time. It's like Bell or Edison in this country, right? It's like they're names that every child has heard, and there's even a town named after him. So it's like it's one of those references that go without saying. And of course it's all positive, right? He's one of the cultural heroes. So to have him associated with a bloodthirsty dictator is super incongruous in an Italian context. Outside of Italy, it loses a little bit. The incongruity is a bit lost because of that. And the same thing probably with the Comboniani. Yeah, that's like the importance of religious orders in Italy cannot be overstated. So in this country, maybe it's harder to get the reference. It's a bit more obscure, but in Italy, it's not obscure at all. You would have met these people. It's a normal everyday occurrence. Unlike usucapione, which is, as you said very correctly, one of these words that's extremely rare.
Yeah, but if I may answer to that, I would argue that all of these words, all these cultural references are present, but are not that present. It's just like we all know who he is. We generally all know what that did he invent. but it's not really a figure that we hear about on a daily basis. And same goes for the Cambodian missionary, at least in my experience. So they're kind of in this blurry area where we all know who they are, or what these concepts are. We all kind of have a general understanding. We all kind of have a set of general informations on them, but we don't really, they most of the times go without saying, or are just like in our mind, although we do have a strong presence of them. Because, for example, talking about the example you were mentioning earlier, like we know and we have a daily relationship with the, at least in Italian culture, with the importance of religious orders, for example. But the Cambodian ones in particular are not a religious order that we would hear about every day. And so it's always like it's like he was always playing on this kind of middle ground, kind of suburbs of the general culture, I would say.
Roberto was also thinking of, because your sound comes and goes, so I lost some of the things you said. You were also saying something about geographical digs, is talking about Ventotene, no? You said something which an Italian would recognize as an island and stuff like this. Also, in that case, that provokes something quite interesting in terms of cultural clash.
Sorry, the audio was glitchy.
Ventotene, no? You also said something about Ventotene, which is a little interesting in terms of geographical references, of course, within the text, which might create some problem to people who are not from Italy.
Of course, of course. Yeah, and the same, it's part of the same reasoning that we were developing earlier. Ventotene is familiar to us as Italians because it's a small island that's famous because it's where European Union was born, or part of it at least, and it's very much associated with the political confinement and political exile in fascist period. So to us, there is a connection, which is also pretty automatic, between Ventotene and dictatorship, because being it a small island, it's like probably the period in which it was most relevant. And so we do associate kind of directly Ventotene with dictatorship. And it's interesting that it appears in this context, in this environment, because we're kind of already going towards that direction, but not really at the same time, because we think we're talking about Bokassa's dictatorship, while at the same time we are activating a semantic network that includes dictatorship per se as a word, which implies the possibility that Ventotene might come across as a word. So that's really the connection, I would say, in the Italian culture.
Great, excellent, thank you. Do we have any other questions? Curiosity?